Wallace. Here it is. I got it. Hi, I'm Carol. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Carol.
And I'm a nervous alcoholic. So thank you, and happy anniversary, y'all. You put on a good spread, and the food was delicious. So thank you so much. It's such an honor to be asked to do anything for Alcoholics Anonymous, and I am very grateful to be here. And no pressure, no pressure at all. My sobriety date is June 16th, 1987. My home group is the First 164 group in Fuquay, Verena. And as you might guess, we study the first 164 pages of the big book, word for word. And I love that group. I just really enjoy and just get so much out of it. We started, it's become a success, well attended, and then we decided we would add a second meeting. So we meet on Monday night at 6:30 for the big book study, and Wednesday night at 6:30 for discussion of the 12 and 12, either a tradition or a step that night. So y'all come. Okay. So I never know what I'm going to say. I'll start out with how I started out at the conference. I was born a long, long time ago. In fact, I just celebrated my 65th birthday in April, so I'm officially old, I guess. And I'm now on Social Security and all that good stuff. So very grateful. I never thought I'd live this long. I don't know if you're like me, but I thought, I would probably die at 30, with the life that I was living. And then, I remember when I came and when I was 34 years old when I came in, and I remember thinking things like, in 2000, how old would I be and how sober would I be, and thinking I would definitely not live till then. I don't know. But AA produces miracles, and I am just so grateful to be here and so grateful to be sober. And so I hope I get that across to y'all. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I used to be like, what happened, and what I'm like now. So I was born in Willow Springs, North Carolina. I don't know if y'all know where that is, but it's about 5 or so miles out of Fuquay. I was born into a home with a daddy who was a drunk. He was a very sick alcoholic. He turned out to be a wino on the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina, and he would be the one that would beg him to lock him up so that he would have a warm place to sleep that night. My mother, she was normal, married to an alcoholic. I'll tell you what, when Mother and Daddy split up, she changed. But I remember, just going along. The first memory that I have, I'll settle down here in a minute. The first memories that I have are of being scared. I didn't know what I was scared of, but I just know that I was always scared. And I always felt like I didn't fit in. And that was a feeling that I had in my family. I didn't even feel like I fit in my family. I remember thinking that I thought that God had given everybody else the instructions for life, but he forgot to give them to me. So I was the middle child. So my sister is about 20 months older than I am. And when I was 7 years old, Mama and Daddy had a baby boy. And his name was Stan, after Stan the Man Musial. And I was a very jealous middle child. I had been the baby for 7 years, and all of a sudden here is this boy that I knew Daddy always wanted. And I was very jealous of him. And I'll share a couple of things about him. So I used to pick on him unmercifully. I did. So he had this little habit of when he would get injured, he would cry so hard that he would turn blue and he would pass out. So for my entertainment, I used to pinch him and watch him turn blue and pass out. So that's what I did. And we used to play a lot of cowboys and Indians, and he would always end up tied up in a blanket in the closet. So I tortured him pretty much. I've since made amends to him. I want to tell you right now, he's sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. So maybe I had a hand in getting him drunk, and maybe, I was an example for him when he got sober. But I have certainly made amends to him for those things. But I just kind of want to show you how self-centered I was. And I was a pretty mean kid, obviously. And growing up in school, I always felt less than. So here we are in this drunk family, and we were very poor because Daddy would go out and he'd get drunk and he would be gone for weeks at a time. And so I would go to school. I remember going to school one day, and what they used to do is they would collect clothing for us because we were the poor kids that the church collected clothing for. And one day in school, a little girl recognized and pointed out that the dress that I was wearing was her old dress. And I just remember the humiliation of that and just feeling just so horrible about it. I used to say, before I got sober, I used to say that if you grew up in the home that I grew up in, then you would be an alcoholic too. Well, then I remembered when I got sober, it says we have to let go of our old ideas. The result was nil till we let go absolutely. I remember it occurring to me that my sister grew up in that same house that I grew up in, and she didn't become an alcoholic. And she did not take things to heart like I took. She wore hand-me-downs too, but those things just didn't affect her like they affected me. So it talks about in the big book how overly sensitive we are, and I can attest to that. I'm definitely overly sensitive, and still am to some degree. I've made a lot of progress, but I still am. So Mother and Daddy split up when I was in the 3rd grade, and I remember coming home and just being devastated. I was scared of my father. But I loved him so much. And we left and we moved in with my uncle and aunt. And what I remember from that is I remember thinking that it's going to be different at this new school I'm going to. They're not going to know me. They're not going to know these things about me. And I'm going to start over. And I'm going to be popular. You're going to like me. And it didn't happen that way. I remember the first thing they said is, "Oh no, another girl," and of course I took that personally. No one likes me, but that was my whole attitude. Was a sentence like that could change that whole optimism for me. It could change the whole optimism. So anyway, I plugged along, and I took my first drink when I was 15 years old. And I don't remember it making me feel beautiful or tall or any of those things. I remember it making me feel numb. I do remember that. I remember, in fact, that I was out with this guy, and I remember drinking a couple of beers and slapping my face and not being able to feel it. And so I turned to him and I slapped him. And he slapped me back. And I felt that one. So that was my first experience with alcohol. And he dropped me off at the end of the driveway, and I stumbled up the driveway, and I walked into my house. And we lived in this little concrete house, and Mother had since remarried and everything. But I stumbled into the house, and my mother is standing there with her arms folded across her chest, tapping her foot, saying, "Where have you been?" And I made up some lie that I thought was good. The car broke down or we ran out of gas. And back then I used to do things like put grease on my hands, like I helped fix the car or something, But anyway, so I thought I'd done really, really good until I turned around and I walked into the wall. And that wall was there. I lived there in this house. I should know where the wall is, but I was pretty drunk. And I walked into the wall, and she just looked at me and she said, "I could smell it from here." And by this time, she did not like alcohol very much. When Daddy and she split up, she became pretty bitter. And she was no fun anymore. And I know now, she had 3 children she was trying to raise. And she had a lot on her plate, and she didn't have much money. And I can imagine why she became the person that she became. But she was not happy with alcohol and the fact that I drank it. And so I got grounded, of course. I'll tell you right now that I spent most of my teenage years grounded, and so therefore, whenever I would go out and do something, I decided that I'm going to be grounded anyway. I might as well stay out and have the most fun, So that was my whole attitude. And I remember too something else that happened is we would go to after school at the church when I was in elementary school. And I remember playing a board game one time with the preacher, and I landed on this thing and it asked a question. It said, "Is it as much a sin to think of something as it is to actually do it?" And I was like, "Of course not." I thought I had that. And he says, "No, it's just as much a sin to think of it as it is to do it." And I made the decision at that time, if I was going to be in trouble for thinking it, I might as well do it. So that's the way I get, you're not going to... You know, you're not going to teach me much. But that was my attitude. And, God, I must have driven my mama crazy. Yeah. And not too long after that, I got drunk again. I swore I would never get drunk again because it hurt so bad, but I got drunk again. And I got in trouble again. And so then after that, not too long after that, I ran away from home, right before my 18th birthday. Mother had turned me over to my stepdad for punishment to straighten me out. And it didn't go very well. I was so rebellious, I was in his face, and we had an altercation, and it turned physical. And so not too long after that, she threatened to turn me over to him again, and I ran away from home. So I was 17 years old. I went to Fuquay High School. I was doing pretty good in school, right? I was in the 12th grade, really short from graduation, about to graduate. But like I said, I ran away from home and moved to downtown Raleigh, and I did not finish school. So I was like just a couple of weeks shy of graduating, and I did not graduate. I moved, like I said, to Hillsborough Street, where I was a wannabe hippie. So this is 1971. And I remember, being braless and, I'm 18 years old now. I turned 18. My first night of working, when I turned 18, I started working the very first night at the Players Retreat. And anyway, so what I would do, I remember standing on Hillsborough Street and the school bus of the kids would go by and I would flash them the peace sign, trying to be really cool, and I just thought I had arrived, and really and truly what I was homeless. I didn't have any place to stay. I would stay wherever I could find to stay. So I got fired from the PR because, I was hungover all the time. I remember my first blackout, or I don't remember my first blackout, but I had my first blackout. Shortly after I started working there, they would give you all the free draft beer that you wanted at the end of the night. And I had my first blackout. And I don't remember thinking that was weird or questioning anything other than I wish that I could remember what happened because I knew I'd had a really, really good time and missed it. So that's the only thing I thought. Right after that, I met this really gorgeous man. Gosh, he was so cute. He had long blonde hair down to his shoulders. He wore tank tops like me. But he had these big muscles and a nice dark tan, and we fell in something together. And oh my gosh. So he asked me to marry him in a blackout, and I reminded him the next day. And he tried to get out of it, but I begged him and I cried and I pleaded, and we ended up eloping, and we knew each other for 2.5 months when we got married. And then right after that, so he flunked out of school, so his mother loved me, I could tell you that. He flunked out of school, and he got a job. He was working at UPS as a package car loader when we first met. And he got a full-time job at UPS driving a package car. But he had to get his hair cut. And I remember he went out to get his hair cut that day, and he came back, and he had gotten his hair cut. And I remember just freaking out. I looked at him, and he had the ugliest square jaw I had ever seen. I did not know he had this jaw because his hair covered it. And so there it was. And up until that point, we would be out and we would be walking down the street, and I would try to hold his hand and say, why won't you hold my hand in public, and blah, blah, blah. Well, after that, if he tried to hold my hand, I would just resist it, and I just didn't want anybody to know that we were together. And so there's another example of how self-centered I was, young. So let me tell you what happened. We were at a party and sitting in a circle doing the things that, you do when you're sitting in a circle in the 1970s. And these cute little girls were there. They were our age, and they were giggling and they were looking at Eddie, and we were like, what? And they said, you look just like Robert Redford. And I'd never seen Robert Redford. But, I did. I went and looked at a picture of Robert Redford. He has this beautiful square jaw. He was gorgeous. My husband looked just like Robert Redford, so I decided to keep him. And so I say that to let you know that it was really important to me then what you thought of me and what you thought about the person I was with. And if you thought he was okay, then he was okay. It didn't matter that I thought he was not so good at first. So anyway, so we get married, and his drinking was pretty bad, and I remember nagging him about his drinking, but and that would definitely come to haunt me later. And I remember saying things to him, "Can't you have a good time without drinking? Why do you have to drink to have fun?" And then we had a tragedy happen in our family. So in 1973, on September the 23rd, his baby brother, who was 15 years old, just short of his 16th birthday, was riding his motorcycle in the woods in White Lake, and somebody put a wire between two trees. And I got the phone call from the minister telling me that he had passed away. And my husband was out riding a motorcycle at the time, and I was just, it was horrible. That's just a memory that I have, but I can tell you that I did not know that there was that much pain in this world. I had no idea. And so right after that, I found out I was pregnant. And I mean, like the Sunday after we buried him, I started having morning sickness. And it was just a real painful time. I'm glad that I got pregnant. I had something to focus on other than that. But what I decided to do, because it was so painful, was I decided that I would pretend that David, the brother-in-law, had never existed, because it just hurt too much to think about him. And I remember thinking at the time that I had this trick that I could do. I could turn off my emotions like I'm flipping a light switch. And I thought that that was an asset. And I can tell you that if I have nothing else in AA, if you've given me nothing else, it's the ability to feel and be present and to love. I was afraid to love my son. I was afraid that if I loved somebody that much and they got taken away from me, that I wouldn't be able to handle it. So it changed me somewhat, and it changed me a lot. And it changed my drinking. So I didn't drink while I was pregnant. But when I drank after I had Brian, my drinking had changed. And one thing I did was I found liquor. I'd always had beer before, so I found liquor, and that worked differently. And it just, everything had kind of changed. And I think that the accident had a lot to do with it. And I think the liquor had a lot to do with it. So we were married, and I'm going out bowling, and he's going out, and we would take turns looking after Brian, my son, when he was born, and my drinking increased. So it's a progressive illness, and so up until this point, I really hadn't had much consequences. My father had gotten sober in 1971. I remember talking to my stepmother, who was also in Alcoholics Anonymous, and she told me that alcoholism is a hereditary illness, and that if she had it, or if he had it, then I would likely have it. I'm here to tell you that my family could start an AA group all its own, and we've got enough sober members we could do it. So, it talks about alcoholism being a family illness. Alcoholism and AA is a family recovery too. It can be, and that's been my experience. Anyway, so my drinking increased. I started, my husband and I split up, and I ended up moving in with a girlfriend who had 2 children, and I had Brian, and she would babysit while I went out, and I would babysit while she went out, and my drinking increased. I had this plan when I was younger that I was going to be the perfect wife and I was going to be the perfect mother. That was the plan. And I'd already proven that I wasn't the perfect wife. And my life went downhill after this. And I was not the mother that I had planned to be. And I always share this. I'm going to share a little bit about it because somebody else shared about their experience. And that's how I got sober. So hope it's not too painful for anybody, but I always share it. So my drinking increased. Brian and I moved, and we got our own little place. And I had this rule that I was only going to drink on weekends. I had all these things that I wasn't going to do. If you drank in the morning, you were an alcoholic. If you did these certain things, you were an alcoholic. And I remember thinking that I was not going to be like my father, and that, and I can tell you, looking back on it, I was already on my way. I remember asking my stepmother when I was, Brian was, before I ever split up with my husband, I asked her, I said, "Do you think I might be an alcoholic?" And she said, if you have to ask, you probably are. And that's just the perfect answer, because I don't think non-alcoholics really think about it all that much. She gave me the questions, and I didn't even remember that I had them until I got sober and found them. The questions are, do you think you may be an alcoholic? I can only tell you that by the time I read those questions, I was already so far into delusion that I could not see the truth. I attended a CFC conference years ago, and the speaker was there, and he said, it talks about everybody says that alcoholism is a disease of denial. And he said, if you look at the 164 pages of the big book, it never mentions the word denial there. It mentions the word delusion. And the difference between denial and delusion is this, he said. He said, denial is when I know the truth and I lie to you. Delusion is when I don't know the truth and I lie to myself. And by the time I got those questions and I was reading those and answering them, I was lying to myself. And I remember thinking, if it ever gets that bad, I'll quit, and doing all those things that we think. But it was already picking up. So Brian and I are living in this little place, in this little apartment. I got a job, got fired from a job, got another job, had a real hard time finding a new job. And I found a job at this place called SAS, which is a computer software company in Cary. I was the 97th employee, and I had a really hard time finding that job. I think that was God doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. It was the 80s when it was really hard to find a job. There was a crash, and I looked and I couldn't get a job, but I got a job at SAS, and that worked out really well. I'll tell you about it later. So I'm working at SAS. I'm actually getting promoted. I'm working hard, but I'm partying hard. And my alcoholism just didn't take me downhill. It would take me and it would lift me up, and then I'd drop, and lift me up again, and I'd drop. And when I dropped, I would always drop lower. And I remember wanting to be this great mother, and I was doing really well for a while. But then when I started going out to shoot pool, I would go out to bars, and Brian was really, really young. And I would call him from the bar. I loved to shoot pool. I would tell you right then I was addicted to pool, but I couldn't admit I was addicted to alcohol. So I would call Brian, and I would say, Mommy's winning at pool. I'll be a little bit late because I'm winning in the pool. And he would say, I'm hungry. And I would say, fix yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, because I'm winning. You don't want me to stop while I'm winning. And so he would, a little bit later, I would call him up, and I would say, Mommy's too drunk to drive. And he would say, I'm hungry, and I'd say, fix yourself a bowl of cereal. You don't want Mommy to get a DWI, or whatever it was called back then. And so that went on many, many times. And he was way too young for me to be leaving him alone. And the guilt over that caused me to drink more. You would think, I would straighten up for a little while and I'd do well, but then I would fall off. That drop would come, and he never knew. Bless his heart, he never knew what to expect. And there would be times that I would wake up not even knowing where I was, and call him. He would be at home by himself and way too young for that. And one time, there was a knock on the door, and it was Department of Social Services. And Brian had been so hungry, he had gone and begged for food in the apartment complex that we lived in. And somebody had called Social Services on me. And I lied, said it was a fluke, it would never happen again. And what I said to him when the woman left, I said, don't ever do that to Mommy again. And I knew better. But I said that because I never wanted him to do that again, because I was afraid he would be taken away. And the guilt was so strong, and I drank more. And this went on for a while. So he was, fast forward real quick. I would do well at work, and then I would do bad. People got promoted over me that I corrected their mistakes, and I remember being so outraged. And I remember one time this girl got promoted, and I was just so furious. How dare she? She's not as smart as I am, all this stuff. And one day I was leaving, and it was raining, and I had my coat draped over my arm. And I stopped by her desk to say something to her, and she jumped. She said, "Oh, I thought you had a gun under there." I mean, I guess that's how I'm thinking that I should get promoted. But I might be a little crazy if they're thinking that maybe I am such a disgruntled employee that I might have a gun under my coat, So I'm starting to get in real big trouble at work. And they had this, they said, "Carol, we don't know why you're late so much, but from now on, if you're more than 15 minutes late, we're going to dock you a half a day's vacation." And I think I got, at the time, 2 or 3 weeks vacation. Excuse me. Well, by the time June rolled around, I was out of vacation. I had missed so many 15-minute, So my boss said, "Carol, I don't know what your problem is, but the next time you're late, we're writing you up. You've got to sign this right now." We did sign that paper that day. She said, "I don't know what your problem is, but if you will go get help, then the next time this happens, I will tell my boss that you're going to get help." And I remember thinking, this will never happen again. I have learned my lesson. I cannot tell you how many times I had thought that. You remember Bill Wilson's story? And how I noticed this several years ago. I've read his story over and over again. I would read his story and I would think, well, now's when he's going to get sober. He's going to get sober now. He has learned his lesson. And he drank again and drank again and drank again. Well, that's what I had done. I should have learned my lesson, but I'm an alcoholic, and I did not learn my lesson. And the thought of giving up alcohol terrified me. So I decided to go and get help. I went back to my office and I looked at our little our handbook, and it said that I could have 5 free visits to a psychologist. And I remember thinking that I'm going to go. I had told all my peers what an alcoholic I was. I finally was admitting that I was an alcoholic. And I'll tell you what, this first step says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives become unmanageable. I had admitted for years that I was an alcoholic, but I had not taken the first step. I did not know that I was powerless over alcohol, and my life was unmanageable, although my life had been unmanageable since day one. So anyway, I went to see this psychologist, and I thought, I've told my friends what an alcoholic I am, and that didn't make me stop. So if I tell some psychologist what an alcoholic I am, tell them all about me, that's going to make me stop. So that's what I did. I went to the psychologist and I told her everything. And I really thought that that would do it. Now, she said immediately, "You need to go into treatment." And my response to her was, "What about my son? What about my job?" And now that's insane. That is insane. Because what about my son and what about my job? And so, like I said, I thought that was going to work, and it didn't. 3 days later, I'm like Bill, pounding on the bar saying, "How did this happen?" And that's when I surrendered. Almost. That's when I said, "I'll go to treatment." And my sobriety date is June 16th. My son's 13th birthday was going to be June the 11th. So what I had decided, they wanted me to go to treatment immediately, but I wanted to stay out until my son's birthday, and then I was going to see him off, and he would go, and I would go to treatment. We didn't quite go like that. SAS made the mistake of giving me some money to bail me out of some stuff, and I used it a little bit for that, but then I used it for other things too, and I had one last binge. And I remember, I just don't want to forget that day. I was so spiritually bankrupt. I remember standing there with my son in our converted hen house that we were living in at this point. And I remember saying, he cried for the first time that I had seen him cry in years. He was a tough little kid. And he was very upset with me because he had asked me if I was an alcoholic, and I had said no. And here I was going to be going away for 28 days. And he was going to be going to stay with his dad, and he was very upset with me. And I remember thinking, if I could feel, this would hurt. I could not wait for him to leave so I could go out and have one last binge before I went to treatment. And so, like I said, June 11th, well, I finally got in there on June 15th. And I had to call my mama and get her to drive me because I knew that on my own I would never make it. And in the meantime, they told me at treatment center that no one would know that I was in there. It's totally, totally confidential. No one will ever know that you're in there. Well, my father knew everybody who worked in that treatment center. He had since gotten sober. He was 17 years sober at this point, and he knew them all, and he knew the second that I did not show up for treatment. And I went back to the house for a change of clothes one day, and I found that he had I found out later, he told me that he had broken into my house, and he thought that I had been kidnapped and the house ransacked, but that's just the way I was living. That's the insane way that I was living. Mother went by while I was in treatment, found all the dishes that were stuck under the sink, and things like that. So that's the way Brian and I were living. So Mother came and she took me to treatment, and the first thing, I just remember being terrified when I got there, and 28 days later, terrified to leave. I could admit that I was powerless finally over alcohol, and my life had become unmanageable. I would not be there if I could have done it myself. There were some people in there that had gotten sentenced in there or somehow, or committed in there, but I really wanted this thing. And I'm happy to say that I've been sober ever since. And I could tell you why, I think, is the grace of God, obviously. But I remember thinking that I'm going to do everything you tell me to do. And if it doesn't work, then at least I can say I tried everything you told me to do. And what happened is, because I did everything you've told me to do, followed your suggestions, I've been sober ever since. So this program really, really works. For the second step for me, and I won't go through all the steps, I know I don't have time, but the second step for me, I thought that I had to know where God began and where He ended. I just remember that I would think about God and I would be scared. To me, God was a get-you God that I grew up with. And so I really had a hard time with the God idea. I thought I had tried that and it hadn't worked. So that's where I was. But then finally what happened in treatment is I got knew that I got such a craving, and I knew the first thing I did when I got out of treatment was not be going to any AA meeting. And that terrified me. And so that forced me to my knees. Up until that point, I had thought about getting on my knees and doing this third step prayer thing, but I was afraid a nurse might come in and catch me on my knees. And at this point, I was so desperate I didn't care if a nurse caught me on my knees. And I remember getting on my knees in my room, and I did this little visualization, and it's in the beginning of the third step in the 12 and 12, where it talks about that you imagine a door and the opening of the door. And I imagined this door in my heart and this light shining behind the door and opening the door and the light flooding in. And I had tried to memorize the third step prayer and couldn't. And I remembered that it said somewhere in the big book that it was okay for me to ask to be helped if somebody else would be helped. Let me say that again. That it was okay for me to ask for something for myself if someone else would be helped. And so I said a simple prayer. I said, God, please keep me sober so that maybe one day I can help another alcoholic. And what happened was I felt electricity flow in and out. It was just like up and down. It was unexpected. All I wanted was for the craving to go away, but what I had was a spiritual contact, a spiritual experience. And I remember thinking that there is a God and He loves me and He wants me to be sober. And that has helped me these last years. I mean, it's helped me all the way through because I don't doubt that experience. I experienced it. I know it happened. And for later on when I did the second step, I still struggled with it because it didn't make a lot of sense. The God that I grew up with just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and I was questioning it. And I know now that I was in the debating society, and I had never read We Agnostics because I wasn't an agnostic. I believed in God. Well, when I read We Agnostics in the big book, it just helped me so much. It really did help me. And then another thing that helped me with my coming to believe was I went to a meeting one time, a convention, And this guy said that if God was small enough for me to understand him, he wouldn't be big enough to help me. And I realized that I didn't have to know where God begins and where he ends for him to help me. And so I just quit thinking of, trying to figure it out. And I just kind of went with it. And they said to go to, the treatment center said 90 meetings in 90 days. I told you I'm a perfectionist. I went to more than that. We had a beginner's meeting and a regular meeting at what would become my home group at Raleigh Big Book. I went to meetings every day for the first 5 years. My son said to me, he said, "Mom, I thought when you got sober you'd be home more." And I said, "Well, at least you know what time I'll be home." And I swear, I think I needed every single one of those meetings to stay sober because I had some close calls. Even going to all those meetings, I had close calls. I had that time, in that first year, they say a day at a time. Well, I had to take it a minute at a time or an hour at a time. I remember getting up and thinking, if I still feel like this at 3 o'clock, by God, I'm going back out. And at 3 o'clock, I'd say, if I still feel this way at 4 o'clock, then I'm going out. And I didn't. I just put it off and put it off. And another thing that happened was I remember thinking about, maybe 3 months sober, I thought, well, I heard all these people talking about their slips. They pick up a white chip and they had a slip. And I remember thinking, maybe I should go ahead and get my slip over with before I get too much time. And so I asked this guy, and he said, no. He says, "I've never slipped." He says, "The people talk about slips, so you don't have to slip." Well, the next beginners meeting I went to, a guy said, "I went out and got my slip over with." So I know that I'm not the only one that thinks that way, but you really don't have to. You don't have to. But if you are, we welcome you back with open arms. I can tell you that too. So life has gone along, and it's been crazy. So, you get sober, and I went to so many meetings, and I threw myself into this program. And I became a GSR, I threw myself into service work. I just love AA, and I want to give back to it because I would be dead. And I know that. And I owe it to you. I owe it to Alcoholics Anonymous. And, when I said that prayer, that third step prayer, "God, please keep me sober so I can help somebody else," it became a whole new ballgame then. Because up until that point, I'd been pretty self-centered, and I remember thinking, why am I here? I'm just sucking air. I'm just like a parasite. I'm just nothing. And I just remember knowing how selfish I was. And I didn't have a problem with the selfishness and the self-centeredness part, believing it. And when I started thinking that I might be able to help somebody else, then my life changed. And it's not been the same. So I need to keep that forefront in my mind still. It talks about in working with others, and it says nothing will so much ensure immunity from alcohol as intensively working with another alcoholic. And I was sponsoring a lot of people. And I remember, things going dull a little bit. But I was not really putting the effort into it that I should have been putting into it. I wasn't intensively working with another alcoholic. I was just like, you're doing good. They've been sober for a while. I need a newcomer. I need somebody who's real, or somebody who's really wanting to work the steps. And for me, when things have gone dull for me, and they have, if I redouble my efforts and I work the steps like I did when I first came in, it all gets better. So I'm a big believer in step work. I'm a big believer in helping others. I'm a big believer in service work. My life got better, so much better. But then my dad got sick, and he had a massive heart attack and was in a coma for 8 weeks. And it wasn't an induced coma, it was like a coma, and he went into septic shock and all these things. He would get worse, and I remember just praying and turning him over to God and just really struggling. And then right after that, my boyfriend broke up with me, and then he started coming to my home group from Myrtle Beach, and my sponsor said, well, maybe he's changed his mind. And I said, or maybe he's dating someone in my home group. And he was. And so, these things are starting to happen. And I had been a good girl. And these things are happening to me. And I thought God and I had some deal. If I work these steps really, really hard and I do these things, then nothing like that's going to happen to me. And I remember feeling scared because I was feeling like a victim, and Carol the victim drank. And that terrified me. And so I remember having this one girl give me a call at the hospital while I'm there. I was at the hospital every day. And she would call me about some problem that wasn't all that big. It certainly wasn't her father dying at death's door. And she would say, "Oh, I shouldn't be bothering you with this." And I would say, "Please call me. Please. I need to get out of myself. I need you. Call me." And, AA has saved me. My mother and my father, my daddy got better. We ended up going fishing again. I love to fish. That's something he and I did. And I love to fish, and we got to do that again. October the 5th, 1999, my mother passed away suddenly. November the 5th of 1999, my father died. He had been sick for a while. You were there. So bad things happen to us in sobriety. If we live long enough, we stay sober, things are going to happen, but we don't have to drink over it. And I remember thinking early in recovery, I thought, am I here for my father or am I here for me? And if Daddy dies, will I drink again? And because he meant everything to me. We bonded, oh my gosh, bonding in AA, and we had such a lot in common. Well, when he passed away, I was at an AA meeting. The only meeting I missed was the night of his wake. And it happened that I was chairing that month, so I was there, and right in the middle of AA. I want to tell you a quick story about what happened at his wake. So my son had started drinking really, really bad, and he had done other things too, and he was pretty bad off, but he had gotten sober for a very brief period of time, and we're there standing in the reception line of the funeral home, and Daddy's over here laying there with a smile on his face, and y'all came, so many of you were there. And Brian said to me, my son Brian said to me, "Mom, that guy over there, he brought a meeting to us in treatment center. Do you mind if I go talk to him?" And I said, go talk to him. And I would look over there every now and then, that they would just be talking animatedly. And I want you to know that he did not get sober right then, but within a year. So I told you, Daddy died. His funeral was in November. My son's sobriety date is September the 1st of 2000. And that guy that was there and talked to him at that funeral parlor is still his sponsor today. And that's why Daddy was smiling. I just think Daddy brought that together. I really do. That's just so miraculous to me. I am so proud of my son, so proud of my brother. My father he helped me a lot. He used to say, when he would know I was going to be speaking, and I would be nervous, of course nervous, and he'd say, "Just tell him what AA has done for you." What AA has done for me. He's given me my son, he's given me my life, he's given me everything that is worth living. I have learned how to do in AA first. I worked for SAS for 33 years and retired a few years ago. Let me tell you one last little story. Okay. One last little story. Daddy had a really good friend, Cam. And they were really so close. And every time, when Daddy was in that hospital for 8 weeks, Cam was there every single day. Well, Daddy got better, and then 6 months later, Cam found out he had cancer. And he died of cancer within just a couple of weeks. And my daddy and I went to that funeral. And the minister talked about what a wonderful guy Cam was. And so I knew he was up there with us every day. But he had been, going to nursing homes and doing all these things that I never knew he did. And my father, we're standing at the graveside, and my father said, "Oh, Cam would not have liked that." He said he wouldn't want anybody to tell. He liked to do things and not tell anybody that he had done them, so he wouldn't have liked that. But as I was driving home that day, I got to 5 Points in Fuquay, and I remember thinking, that me and my girlfriends were always talking about how we have so much love to give. But we were talking about for a man. We were talking about, I have so much love to give if I only found a man. And I thought, if I've really and truly got that much love to give, I am giving it to the people that God puts in my life. I'm not hoarding it for a man. I am loving the people God puts in my life. And so I made this commitment to just really do that, to be open. And God put more women in my life to sponsor. And one of the women, beautiful, beautiful girl named Karen Ross, and she told me the day she asked me to be her sponsor, she told me she was terminally ill. And I sponsored her for a number of years. And then when she died, it was so painful. It was so painful to watch this. When she died, though, she had asked me to do her memorial service. And so her husband was like, "We are not going to have a sad service. We are going to have a celebration of Karen's life." And Karen was funny as she could be, and that's exactly what she wanted, was a celebration. So I would get together with Lou, Karen's husband, and we would go over the funeral arrangements. And we met time after time, and the memorial service happened. It was beautiful. And later on, he asked me out. And he and I have been married now for 5 years. And I'm getting chills just thinking about it. I never, ever thought that would be a byproduct of me working with others, But we are happily married, and he is funny as he can be. And I told you how much I love to fish. Well, we are building a house on the lake at Carolina Lakes, and we are moving down here. It's supposed to be July the 18th, so I'm going to be a neighbor. And I'm hoping to come here and come to meetings. So I'm just really excited about coming down here. And I plan to be out there on that shoreline fishing. And, and so does my husband. So we're going to have fun. And so what is AA giving to me? What is AA giving to me? I'm just so grateful. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for having me.